Some very revealing numbers, I think we can all agree, from this past weekend's NFL draft as it relates to the continued dominance of the SEC and Power 5 versus G5 and all that. And I'm not going to waste time making this a Southeastern Conference infomercial. You guys all know those stats already. But what I wanted to do, and I tweeted this out a couple of times over the weekend, including about an hour or two before we went on air tonight, is I wanted to talk about a really good article that our own Bud Elliott put out. Now, as I was watching the draft, we have our own Slack channels for 24/7 Sports, and Bud drops in there, and he says, wait till you guys see this stat that I just uncovered. And he's doing a lot of work. They're trying to pump out a lot of articles and whatnot, trying to capitalize on draft traffic, which they did a very good job of. And so he includes me in the raw Word document or Pages document, whatever file he's using. So I got to see it before he published it, and I said, man, I got to lead the show with this. I think I tweeted it out Friday. I'm leading Late Kick with this. And so what I want to do is I want to briefly reset my position so that we're all clear on where I stand here. I do not believe in college football playoff expansion, 4 and no more. If there is expansion, which even I have to admit to you seems inevitable, I don't have to be for it, but it seems inevitable. If there is expansion, I am not for auto bids. I'm not for guaranteeing a Power 5 conference champion a seat at the table, so I'm certainly not in favor of guaranteeing any G5 champion or otherwise a seat at the table. I'll go a step further. I don't believe in spots for the G5 period at the college football playoff table. Now, I'm going to make the argument for that in just a second because it sounds really exclusionary and unfair, and in some ways maybe it is. I just don't think it's my problem. I think the G5 should have its own separate playoff. That is my stance, okay? Now, the rebuttals, anytime that I've gone down this road, the rebuttals are always, well, if the G5 had its own playoff, and I'm just accumulating the ones I saw this weekend given to me on Twitter. If the G5 had its own playoff, it wouldn't be able to remain financially viable. Again, probably true. I don't know that that's true, actually, but let's say it's true. Whose problem is that? Is it someone else's job to subsidize you? I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. The second rebuttal, how would they get by without the cash infusion that they get from playing in the New Year's Six games? I never said exclude them from the New Year's Six games. I just said exclude them from the college football playoff conversation. The G5 deserves to be in. They've proven. Now, this is the one, this is always the go-to. This is the one that I just want to rip to shreds. The G5 deserves to be in, and what is the argument commonly? It's because they've proven they can play with Power 5 teams on the field any given day. And guess what? You're dead on the money right. And guess what? It doesn't matter. Number one, no, you have not ever proven as a G5 team that you can play with a Power 5 team in a playoff setting. But number two, even if you did, guys, that's never been the argument. And this is where I want to bring up Bud Elliott's piece. That's never been the argument, at least from people that I'm in a camp with. It's never been the argument that if Central Florida were to get in a semifinal matchup against Alabama, they wouldn't even be competitive. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, but that's never been my argument. I don't care about what you can do in one game. I care about the journey it takes to get there. I care about the challenge that you have to go up against to get there. So I want to bring in Bud Elliott's piece here. And what he did was essentially he was just accumulating. I'm going to start with a rolling 4-year average. And this is really looking at first-round talent taken in the draft, okay? There's no surprise here. I don't think there's any shocking stat. A rolling 4-year average, writes Bud, can help show the declining contribution of the G5 schools in the first round of the NFL draft. And sure enough, precipitously, the amount of G5 players being taken in the first round declines every year. It was 87% of first rounders being from Power 5 schools 2011 to 2014. 2017 to 2020, the latest 4-year period, 92% of players taken in the first round are from Power 5 schools. SEC, ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12. Now that's obvious, okay? No one was going to argue, hey, most of the talent in the first round is in the Power 5. But then I want to continue. And I want you to listen to this part specifically. The talent flight to the Power 5 via conference expansion. Here's why I want you to listen to this. Because another one of the rebuttals that I get a lot of times is, well, we're never going to be allowed into this club. It's very exclusionary. They won't let us in. And that's an interesting rebuttal because I ask, how'd TCU get in? Where'd West Virginia come from? How's Rutgers at this table? Syracuse? Pittsburgh? Louisville? How'd they get in here? Pause, and let's continue. Bud writes, the numbers in the first round do roughly match up with some of the best G5 teams joining Power 5 leagues through conference expansion, and they are not being replaced by similar quality teams in the G5 ranks. Now, the teams he's talking about here, Utah going to the Pac-12, TCU and West Virginia joining the Big 12, Pitt and Syracuse in the ACC, Rutgers to a lesser degree in the Big 10, and Louisville in 2014, they started in the ACC. So there's a perception, first off, before I get to my main point, that I want to knock down here like a piñata. The perception is, okay, maybe there's a gap, but those G5 teams any given year, they're closing the gap. No, they're not. They're not at all. There may be a blip on the radar screen like a Boise State or a UCF, and they are the exception to the rule. But when it comes to the top of the Power 5, gap's not closing at all, guys. The gap is very much widening here. Now I get to more of the money quotes. I'm not done talking about that gap yet, but I want to get to the money quotes because that gap's far wider than it looks. I want you to consider what I'm about to read and tell me what this has to do with who should make the playoff, because I'm going to tie the two together. Conference expansion among Power 5 teams has made the Group of 5 weaker than ever before from a talent perspective. And then Bud continues, and this was the hammer. Since the final Power 5 expansion, which was a few years ago, let's start with the 2015 draft, every single Power 5 conference has had more picks in the first round than the rest of the Group of 5 combined. At this point, we're not talking about the SEC. The SEC has had 61 first-round picks since the 2015 draft. The ACC is second with 33. But let's not even talk about that. The Big 12 has been by far the lowest performing Power 5 conference when it comes to sending kids in the first round. The Big 12 has only sent 15 kids in the first round since 2015. It's not a good number, is it? Well, pause and let me read you this. American Athletic Conference, 6. Mountain West, 4. Conference USA, 2. The entire MAC has sent 1. Add them all up, and it still doesn't equal the amount of teams that the worst Power 5 conference has sent. And so what does all this mean? Let's go back to the argument that I said was given all the time. The argument that's given all the time is, okay, maybe the schedules aren't comparable, and maybe UCF, for example, does have a lighter load to bear in the regular season, but they've shown, Boise State has shown, fill in the blank team any given year has shown in the past, if they're given the opportunity on a neutral field, any one given Saturday or whatever night they play the semifinal games or big-time bowl games, any given night, any given four-quarter stretch, they can compete and they can win. Sure can. It's never been the argument. I want you to think about what it takes to get there, because the argument has always been, what are you exposed to? How many risks does your schedule force you to take? How many violent collisions does your schedule force you to take? How many elite athletes, maybe even on teams that are going to eventually go 7-5, but can batter your roster in the process of you beating them, are you forced to compete against? Consider Texas A&M this year. Texas A&M, by my math, probably faced more draft eligible players that were eventually going to be drafted. They probably faced more this year alone than some of these teams will face in a 3-decade stretch. They're not even playing the same sport, is what I'm telling you. Whatever you're capable of come season's end in any 4-quarter stretch is because you haven't been beaten into oblivion, and that's always been the cry. The cry is not what are you capable of in any one game. The cry is Texas A&M. The reason I bring them up is they weren't even on the verge of being in the conversation this year. I think they lost 4 or 5 games, whatever the case was. Texas A&M's probably favored against a minimum 11 games of Central Florida's schedule this year. What does it mean? Well, it means that the caliber of team isn't so much the variable here, it's the schedule. And you got to ask yourself this too. You play teams down here that have several future NFL players on their schedule. I'm not just talking about in the SEC, and they may end up going 8-4. Texas A&M's a perfect example. Would you rather have played them? I asked a coach, off the record, of course, and this I think would surprise a lot of you. It didn't surprise me. I asked a coach, would you rather face, this was a playoff caliber team coach was on, would you rather face Texas A&M or would you rather face Memphis this year? And the answer, without hesitation, was Memphis. Doesn't sound right, does it? Memphis was a team that in any given year as of late is pushing for one of those G5 automatic bids. They're a double-digit win team. Texas A&M wasn't even in the playoff conversation. Here's what that coach knew. They'd beat either one of those teams. But in the process, they'd lose 2 or 3 guys playing against Texas A&M. Because Texas A&M has a bunch of 6'4.5", 315-pound guys that can run sideline to sideline. And the collisions, even though they're going to go 7-5, don't make your training room any less full the following morning. You have to pay the price when you play a Power 5 schedule that you don't necessarily get asked to pay if you play a G5 schedule. That was tougher to say than I thought it was going to be. So here's the final synopsis that Bud put in this piece. I thought it was really good to conclude with this. He kind of asked, transfer portal. What's the transfer portal going to do here? Because there are a lot of folks, erroneously in my opinion, that believe now that the transfer portal is this revolving door and eventually it's thought to be a matter of when, not if, legislation will be passed that makes anyone eligible to transfer one time without having to sit out, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of people would suggest to you, okay, once we get that legislation enacted, then all of a sudden, a lot of players who don't start for Power 5 teams are going to find their way to G5 rosters, and that's what's going to close the gap. I'm telling you, it's not. This is what Bud writes. Could the coming transfer portal rule relaxations help to change the disparity in these numbers a bit? Perhaps, but it's also possible, and he's dead on the money here, that the best of the players from the G5 might look to move up to the Power 5 to finish their careers. It's going to be a net loss for you at the G5 level. I am telling you, because for every kid who can't crack the 2 deep, or maybe can't crack the starting lineup at Clemson or Oklahoma State or Texas, you're going to have kids that as freshmen wouldn't have made much of an impact at Auburn, but as juniors and seniors, maybe late developers, late bloomers, athletically and physically, all of a sudden they're playing at Tulsa, and they walked in the program at 6 foot, 175 pounds, and now all of a sudden they're a 6'3", 205-pound receiver with sub 4.5 speed, and all of a sudden Auburn would want that kid. Those kids will look to elevate to finish their careers. And that's the way that that's going to play out. I can almost promise you it's not going to be this great big leap in potential athleticism and an edge that you didn't have previously, whereas now you have it at the G5. The Power 5 is always going to win in that equation. So I thought that was a really good piece by Bud. And it's all numbers. It's all fact. It's all data. And you can interpret it any way you want to. But every argument that I get back in my face that includes needing to involve the G5 in the playoff picture and in the playoff table is all based on feeling and emotion. There is no data. There is no logic-based argument that's ever presented to me that makes any sense. It's all, well, it's not nice to keep them out. It's not fair. It's not right. Well, who writes the rule book? Who decides that? And by the way, this table you guys talk about, some of you talk about all the time, where just the elites hang out and they don't ever let anyone in their club. Well, that argument, number one, is blown to smithereens when you talk about Utah or TCU or West Virginia. These aren't programs in New York or LA or Miami, San Francisco. These aren't just media market overrides. You can come in here, maybe Rutgers, but the other ones, the Morgantown, West Virginia TV market and surrounding area, you're telling me that's why West Virginia got invited to the club? What about Louisville? What about Utah? Do they really need Salt Lake City's TV viewing market at the table in order to prop their coffers up even more than they already are? No. There's a way to get in here, but you got to understand something. These folks who built the table and these folks who created this entire climate with, in some cases, tradition and investment and just caring a great deal emotionally about programs that extend over 100 years back, sometimes, believe it or not, they're very hesitant to watch a program that just popped up out of nowhere in the last 5 years and say, yeah, come on in. Have an equal seat at the table that we had to take 75 years to reserve ours at. That's not the way that works. It's not the way that it would work if the roles were reversed, nor should it. So you talk about fair. I could counter that argument. I could counter if things were truly fair, they wouldn't even give you the time of day. At least they're willing to somewhat acknowledge that you belong here. But I'll tell you this as we move on. I've already spent too much time on this. I will tell you this. We read 2 weeks ago where an anonymous athletic director at a G5 school sort of floated this idea of a class action antitrust lawsuit if, when there's a playoff expansion, the Power Five doesn't allow them to have an auto bid into that dance. And see, that's all in a kind of a vacuumed chamber. And it's not acknowledging that if you want to throw that antitrust language out there, a lot of folks at this level are able to counter with just peeling that NCAA sticker off their helmets and walking away entirely. And there goes the wallet with them. So be careful. Don't rock that boat too much would be my advice.